It began as a structure of plain timber and weathered stone, built by hands long dead, standing in the wide fields of Holloway land. To most, it was only a barn, a place to store hay and shelter animals, but the villagers spoke of it with caution. They said it creaked even when the air was still, that its beams groaned as though remembering something they could not forget. The Holloway family kept it in careful repair, though its walls seemed always to sag and breathe like an old lung, never entirely at rest. Travelers passing through claimed they felt watched while near it, a pressure behind the eyes, a whisper too faint to catch. The brothers who would later become infamous spent their childhood within its shadow, and in that shadow something wordless and heavy grew with them. Inside the barn, the air never felt quite right. Cold clung to the corners in summer, and in winter the hay steamed with unnatural warmth. Livestock refused to settle there, shifting and kicking through the night until bones broke from exhaustion. Farmers who hired out the Holloway's land often avoided the barn, leaving tools in the fields rather than stepping inside. Some swore they had heard breathing from the rafters, not the breath of animals, but long-drawn inhalations, followed by silence that seemed to listen. The Holloway parents dismissed such fears, insisting that superstition had no place in work. Yet they too locked the doors earlier than was needed, and their children were never allowed to linger once chores were done. But Nathaniel, Elias, and Abram did linger. The barn became their hidden world. They found cracks in the walls where light shaped strange patterns on the dust, where knots in the wood looked like staring eyes. They whispered secrets into the air and pretended it whispered back. The sound of shifting boards at night became a lullaby, a private language no one else could understand. It was not the barn's emptiness that bound them, but its presence, as if the building itself noticed them when the rest of the world did not. Years later, neighbors would swear they saw the boys speaking with the walls, their faces tilted upward as if listening for instruction. By day, the brothers seemed ordinary. Nathaniel carried baskets for his mother. Elias sang softly while weeding gardens. Abram's eyes sparkled when he asked endless questions of the schoolmaster. They smiled easily, never raising suspicion beyond the usual mischief of boys. Yet at dusk, when the barn settled into groans and the fields turned gray, their innocence folded into something sharper. They returned to the barn as if compelled, watching how dust drifted like ash when no one moved, how rope swayed from rafters though no breeze entered. They studied these motions not as children playing, but as witnesses collecting detail, memorizing patterns, trying to grasp what the barn was asking them to learn. The villagers told stories to comfort themselves, saying the barn was cursed by an old plague or haunted by farmhands who had starved in the fields. But the truth was quieter, more ordinary, and far more dangerous. The barn was not haunted. It was only empty wood, but within its emptiness, the Holloway brothers found a mirror for their own unspoken hunger. Each creak in the rafters became permission. Each shadow stretched into a command. They began to believe that cruelty was not invented by men but taught by places, and that the barn itself had chosen them to carry its lessons forward. As the years stretched, the barn did not change shape, yet it never stood still. Its shifting silence wove itself into their blood. Long before the world would know the Holloway name, before the first victim disappeared, the barn had already written its story in their minds. And when the doors finally closed on innocence, no one in the village could say they had not been warned. The Holloway brothers grew like weeds among the fields, their lives blending with the rhythm of rural work and worship. To the town, they were no different than any other farm boys. Nathaniel, the eldest, bore a steady calm that made neighbors trust him with errands. Elias, a year younger, carried an easy charm, often humming while he walked, his voice soft enough to soothe crying infants. Abram, the youngest, was small and restless, his endless questions about nature and scripture making adults smile with patience. Together they appeared ordinary, a trio of boys shaped by chores, Sunday sermons, and the hard soil of their land. Their innocence was a mask that fit too well, one that hid the hollowness waiting behind their eyes. In public, they laughed when they were supposed to laugh, joined prayers without hesitation, and worked in silence when asked. Their parents were respected in the village, and so the children carried that respect like a shield. Yet behind their quiet obedience lived an unease that only the most perceptive could sense. At markets, when the brothers stood still among the crowd, their gazes sometimes lingered too long on the movement of a butcher's knife, or on the way a pig's body twitched when slaughtered. When other children cried at the sight of blood, the Holloway boys only watched, their faces unreadable. They did not recoil, nor did they smirk. They simply studied, storing each detail away as if it was knowledge meant for later use. Nathaniel's calmness held a weight. He walked through life as though he were already older than his years, as if some secret wisdom pressed his shoulders down. His silence was not shy, but calculating, the kind of silence that listens for what others do not say. Elias's charm, too, was not as harmless as it seemed. His smiles came at the perfect moment, his laughter timed like an actor's cue. He knew what people needed to hear to trust him, and he gave it freely, though he cared little for the warmth it created. Abram's curiosity was the most unsettling of all, for he asked not about games or stories, but about what made things die and how long it took. To adults, these questions seemed childish and strange, but not alarming. To the barn, those questions were seeds planted in fertile soil. What the village could not see was the ritual that shaped them after dark. When chores ended and their parents slept, the brothers returned to the barn. There, innocence fell from them like dust shaken from coats. Nathaniel recorded the day's observations with charcoal on scraps of wood, sketching the curve of a tendon or the droop of a dying animal's head. Elias tested how long a chicken's body twitched after its throat was cut, timing the spasms with his breath, not out of cruelty, but curiosity laced with reverence. Abram whispered questions into the rafters, waiting as if an answer would creak back through the beams. Together they built a language that no one else understood, a way of interpreting silence as instruction. By day, they carried this hidden knowledge under the thin skin of boyhood. Their classmates saw only laughter during school games, their pastor saw bowed heads in prayer, and their parents saw diligence in chores. Yet behind the laughter was hunger. Behind the prayers was calculation, and behind the diligence was a secret rhythm timed by the creaks of the barn. Their innocence became a costume they wore so well that even they sometimes forgot the difference between their public selves and the selves the barn had claimed. What made them dangerous was not open defiance or obvious cruelty, but the way they slipped between roles without effort. No one could point to a single moment that betrayed them. Their neighbors would later recall that they were kind, even helpful. They mended fences, carried heavy baskets for the elderly, and played with younger children. Yet when those same neighbors remembered their eyes, a shiver followed. There was always a moment, brief and fleeting, when their gazes turned glassy, as though they were not looking at people but through them, searching for something only they could see. It is easy to fear monsters when they snarl and bare teeth. It is far harder when monsters smile politely and help carry your load home from the market. The Holloway brothers perfected that art of blending, their hollow eyes hidden behind innocent faces. They became reflections of what the village wanted to see, while in truth they belonged not to the town, not even to their family, but to the barn that had claimed their thoughts long ago. And as the seasons turned, that hunger behind their silence only grew, waiting for its first chance to step beyond observation and into action. Her name was Clara Whitfield, a seamstress who wandered from village to village, stitching garments and mending clothes in exchange for bread or coins. She arrived in Holloway one autumn morning, her cart filled with fabric ribbons and needles that glimmered like silver teeth in the sun. The villagers welcomed her work, and for several days she moved from cottage to cottage, sewing quietly, her hands steady and sure. She was seen speaking kindly to the Holloway boys at market, laughing as Abram tried on a scrap of ribbon like a crown. To the town it looked harmless, a fleeting kindness shown to restless children. No one saw how their eyes followed her, how they studied not her smile but the rhythm of her breathing, the way her fingers twitched when she pulled thread through cloth. On her final night in the village, Clara packed her cart. Witnesses recalled Nathaniel and Elias helping her load baskets while Abram held the lantern steady. They appeared polite and eager, insisting they would not let her leave in darkness without help. She smiled at their manners, perhaps believing their kindness was genuine. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. By morning, the cart was gone, and Clara had vanished as if swallowed by the earth. At first, the villagers believed she had left early to reach the next town before nightfall. But when her belongings were found days later, her cart overturned in a ditch far from the road, fear began to seep into every corner of Holloway. The search began with shouts in the fields and lanterns raised high into the night. Men dragged the riverbanks, women combed the woods, and children whispered of wolves. But wolves do not leave ribbons behind. Weeks later, a group of children chasing each other through the Holloway barn stopped suddenly, their laughter collapsing into silence. Hanging from the rafters above were strands of fabric, not hay twine or rope, but ribbons in colors of crimson, cream, and faded blue. Each had been cut into the same length, measured with deliberate care, and tied to the wood so they swayed gently with the drafts. The children stared, their young minds unable to grasp the meaning, until one girl noticed the brown stains that spread across the edges of silk like bruises. The discovery spread quickly, but no one dared to confront the Holloway family directly. The brothers denied nothing because they were never asked. The village convinced itself the ribbons were only remnants Clara had left behind, a careless accident from her time sewing. But at night, whispers grew darker. Some claimed the ribbons were not hung for beauty but for marking, as if each length measured the span of breath before it broke. The barn groaned in the wind, and villagers swore they could hear the faint rustle of fabric twisting in the rafters like a throat tightening. For the brothers, Clara's disappearance was not a crime, but a lesson. Nathaniel recorded how quickly a body could lose strength when deprived of light. Elias measured the tension of fabric against skin, marveling at how a ribbon meant for beauty could silence a voice forever. Abram listened to the barn itself, hearing approval in the shifting boards, as if the structure had absorbed her last breath into its beams. To them, Clara was not a woman with laughter and warmth. She became a study, an experiment, a ritual carried out beneath the watchful eyes of the barn. They felt no guilt, only a sharpened hunger, a sense that they had uncovered a hidden language of suffering that others were too blind to see. The village did not yet speak of murder. They told themselves Clara had fled, that the overturned cart was only misfortune, that the ribbons were a childish game. Denial became their shield, but silence was the soil where the Holloway brothers grew. With Clara, the line between thought and action had been crossed, and though no one would admit it, the barn had claimed its first offering. What remained was not a disappearance, but the beginning of a ritual that would not stop. The ribbons swayed above the beams, each cut with purpose, whispering of what was still to come. After Clara's disappearance, the Holloway brothers no longer wandered the barn as curious children. They moved with purpose, as if they had been taught something they could not unlearn. The ribbons still hung from the rafters, swaying with drafts. But now they were no longer trophies. They were reminders of what silence could hold, proof that life could be reduced to fragments, measured and displayed. Nathaniel, Elias, and Abram were no longer content to watch suffering in the world around them. They began to shape it, to design it, to capture it as though it could be preserved like grain in a barrel. It was Abram who first spoke of breath, though he never named it aloud in the presence of others. He had noticed, during Clara's final moments, how the barn itself seemed to echo her struggle, how each gasp filled the room with a rhythm that felt alive. He told his brothers that the air itself changed when someone was afraid, that the last exhale lingered longer than any scream. Nathaniel listened, his calm expression masking the way the idea rooted in his mind. Elias smiled faintly, already imagining ways to test it. Breath was invisible, but they began to believe it could be caught, sealed, and owned. Their first experiment was clumsy. They let a stray dog into the barn, coaxed it with scraps until it trusted their hands. Elias held a large glass jar, stolen from their mother's kitchen, while Nathaniel bound the animal's snout inside with strips of cloth. Abram crouched in the corner, watching, waiting, holding his own breath in a strange imitation of the creature's panic. The dog thrashed, its chest rising in quick bursts, and the sound filled the barn like drums beating too fast. When the body finally stilled, the brothers did not cry or turn away. Instead, they leaned over the jar, staring as if the air inside had transformed into something sacred. Nathaniel marked the wooden wall with a nail, a single scratch to record what had happened. Abram whispered that they had caught its last weather. It was not enough. Soon animals became only practice. They wanted people because people left behind more than silence. People left scratches, claw marks, sounds that seemed to belong to the barn itself. Their first human victim was a vagrant who wandered the fields, a man the villagers dismissed as worthless. He was coaxed into the barn with offers of food, only to find himself seated before a row of jars. Nathaniel bound his wrists, Elias pressed the mouth of the jar against his lips, and Abram counted his breaths aloud, voice steady, as if guiding him through a prayer. The man fought, twisting, his teeth clashing against glass, but the cloth bindings held. His panic filled the air, louder than any storm, until it was cut short by the invisible wall of his own exhale. When his body collapsed, the jar fogged for a moment, then cleared, holding nothing but emptiness. To the Holloway brothers, that emptiness was everything. They grew methodical. Each victim was made to breathe until they could not, their final moments scratched into the barn's walls by Nathaniel's steady hand. The victims' nails left their own frantic messages, too. Gouges in wood and dirt, markings that never aligned with Nathaniel's precise notches. Elias began timing each struggle, noting how long it took for fog to vanish from the glass once the body went still. Abram knelt near each jar afterward, inhaling deeply, as though he might steal whatever lingered inside. He swore he could taste the fear, feel it cooling his throat. They called the ritual capturing last weather, believing that every exhale was not just air, but the storm of a soul leaving. The jars multiplied, stacked carefully along the barn's shelves. To an outsider, they would have looked empty, harmless, nothing but glass-catching dust. But to the brothers, they were relics, proof of control over something unseen. Each jar belonged to a person who no longer breathed, and so each jar was heavy with meaning. The barn smelled of hay and rot, yet also of something sharper, a sourness that clung to the tongue. The brothers felt it was the residue of what they had trapped, an invisible fingerprint left behind by death itself. The villagers noticed only small changes. A man who had wandered the fields was gone. A stray dog that once begged for scraps vanished. The Holloways still smiled. still bowed their heads in church, still helped carry baskets at market. Their faces remained innocent, their eyes hollow but overlooked. None could imagine that inside the barn, shelves of glass stood waiting, each one holding nothing visible, yet each one containing what the brothers believed was the last, most intimate part of a life. And so the ritual continued with growing patience and precision. The barn had whispered its lesson, and the Holloway brothers had obeyed. Breath, once seen as the most fragile and ordinary thing, had been transformed into property. Each jar was a secret storm, sealed in silence, waiting in the dark. And in their hunger, the brothers knew that silence was not an ending. It was only the beginning of a language they were still learning to speak. The jars lined on the shelves of the Holloway barn stood in rows like silent witnesses, their emptiness pretending to be harmless. Yet the brothers were restless, unsatisfied by invisible storms sealed behind glass. Breath, for all its mystery, vanished too quickly. They wanted something that stayed, something they could see and touch, something that carried the weight of silence itself. It was Elias who first suggested the tongue. He had watched victims gasp and thrash, mouths open and desperate, their last words swallowed before they could be spoken. To him, the tongue was the anchor of voice, the muscle that carried all prayers, all lies, all cries for help. If they could take that anchor, perhaps they could own silence in a way no jar could. The idea grew like mold in their minds, feeding on the damp corners of thought where morality no longer reached. Nathaniel saw the practicality. A tongue was flesh. It could be measured, weighed, catalogued like any specimen. Abram, ever drawn to ritual, believed that removing it was more than cruelty. It was cutting out the very part of a person that tethered them to others. Without speech, a person was erased from the community, reduced to a husk. And the barn, with its beams and nails, seemed ready to hold this new harvest. Their first attempt was clumsy but deliberate. They lured a beggar inside with bread and warmth. When the man sat, grateful and trusting, Nathaniel bound him with practiced calm. Elias pressed a blade against his lips, almost tenderly, as though asking permission. Abram knelt beside him, whispering words of comfort that turned sharp when the steel cut deep. The man's scream rose high and broken, then dissolved into gurgling silence as the brothers worked with grim patience. When the tongue came free, slick and trembling, Elias lifted it as if presenting an offering. Nathaniel pinned it to a barn beam with a nail, the wet flesh quivering like a grotesque flag. Abram stepped back, eyes wide, certain the barn itself shuddered in approval. From then on, the ritual gained shape. Victims were chosen not for guilt or innocence, but for the usefulness of their voices. A farmer known for loud arguments, a widow who sang hymns at dawn, a boy who recited verses too quickly at school. Each one was taken when chance allowed, each one silenced in the barn. The brothers grew skilled, their movements steady, their tools sharpened. They no longer flinched at blood spraying across straw or the guttural cries that came before silence. Instead, they listened to the final gurgle with reverence, as if it was a hymn. The barn itself changed. Where once it smelled only of hay and damp wood, now it reeked of iron and rot. Tongues nailed to the beams dried slowly, curling at the edges, darkening with time. Some hung low enough to brush the hair of those forced to kneel beneath, forcing the victims to feel the presence of others already taken. To step inside was to enter a chapel of mutilated voices, a place where silence was not absence, but dominance. The villagers, unaware of the grotesque display, still avoided the barn, muttering that it was cursed. In truth, it was no curse. It was designed. Nathaniel kept count, scratching marks into wood to note each harvest. Elias refined his cuts, experimenting with how much could be removed before a person drowned in their own blood. Abram, half in awe, half in madness, began speaking to the nailed tongues as though they were still alive, asking them questions only silence could answer. Together they convinced themselves that they were not killing but transforming. Each pinned tongue was a relic, proof that they had conquered the human voice. Words could no longer protect, no longer plead, no longer pray. Only silence remained. A silence that they believed belonged not to the victims but to the barn itself. And so the Holloway brothers continued, their faces still innocent in daylight, their eyes hollow but hidden behind polite smiles. The village saw 3 helpful sons, quiet and dutiful, never imagining the chapel of flesh that grew in secret. The brothers no longer questioned what they were becoming. They were disciples carrying out a ritual that felt older than themselves, guided by the creaks of wood and the weight of silence. Each new harvest was not an end, but a step deeper into the abyss where silence was not peace but possession. He was a blacksmith named Garrett Tull, a man built from muscle, heat, and hammer swings. His hands had shaped the tools of the village for 20 years, nails, hinges, blades, horseshoes, each one perfectly formed through repetition and force. He was respected but not well liked. His words were short, his eyes heavy, and his body carried the tiredness of someone who had seen too much too early. He lived alone in a house of soot and iron where the firelight never went out, and no one knew if he slept. It made him easy to take. When he disappeared, the villagers shrugged at first. They said he likely wandered off to find metal in the hills or drank too much and fell into a ditch. No one looked for him until it was far too late. The Holloway brothers had not taken him out of rage or convenience. Garrett Tull was chosen for one reason only: his strength. His arms were thick with veins and scars, his joints stiff from years of turning metal into tools. To Nathaniel, he was a mechanism waiting to be taken apart. Elias had noticed the way his elbow cracked when he lifted a hammer, how his knee bent with precision when he climbed his forge ladder. Abram believed the man moved like a clock, his limbs ticking in quiet, deliberate patterns. It was Elias who first called him the village's timekeeper, and so they built a frame for him. Not a cage, not a cross, but something entirely new. A wheel of wood and rope, a structure shaped like the face of a great clock with pegs to hold each limb at a different angle. Garrett was drugged when they brought him in. Not fully unconscious, just slowed, enough for fear to remain but not strong enough to fight. They worked in near silence. Nathaniel held the body steady, Elias bent each joint back with careful force, and Abram whispered numbers as he watched the limbs move into place. The pain must have been unbearable, but Garrett never screamed the way others had. He groaned, a low and constant sound, the kind of sound that doesn't beg for mercy, only warns that something inside has broken. They bent his elbows until they faced backward, twisted his wrists until his palms pointed toward the ceiling, dislocated his shoulders to reach impossible angles. The legs were harder, his thighs resisted, and his ankles cracked loud enough to make Abram cover his ears. Still, they managed it. They pinned each joint into position not randomly but with a method, 12 points like the face of a clock, each limb marking an hour. And then they waited. They did not leave him to die. They stayed in the barn with him, watching as his body trembled with pain, as muscles spasmed against the ropes, as breath came in shallow waves. The clock was not meant to tell time. It was meant to suffer it. Every twitch, every flinch, every involuntary jerk was counted as a chime. Elias called out the hours, each movement matched with a number. When Garrett coughed at the 3rd hour, Abram smiled. When he convulsed at the 6th, Nathaniel carved the moment into the wood floor beneath him. At the 9th hour, Garrett began to weep, but his tears were slow and dry, wrung from a body that no longer had much left to give. The Holloway brothers did not speak of him afterward as a victim. They referred to him as the broken clock. His frame was left standing in the barn, empty of flesh but soaked in memory. Ropes still held the shape of his body, stiff with dried blood and twisted fibers. The wooden pegs were numbered now. Roman numerals burned into the grain, marking where each joint had been stretched to breaking. The villagers would not know until much later what the barn had held that night. But the barn knew. Its beams creaked louder in the days that followed, as if mocking the hours that had passed. Nathaniel recorded it all in his hidden journal. The angles, the times, the tension of rope, the duration between final breath and final twitch. He called it the study of mechanical decay. Elias marked the wall with 12 short lines, each representing a stage of failure. Abram, still believing in the sacred nature of the barn, declared that the clock had been a test, and the barn had approved. From that day forward, the Holloways no longer saw pain as chaos. They saw it as rhythm. They believed the body could be trained to tick, to fall apart like machinery with the right touch at the right pace. And so in the Holloway barn, time itself was no longer measured by sun or bell. It was marked by screams that came late, twitches that arrived on the hour, and silence that settled when the last limb fell still. The village of Eldam prided itself on its quiet, a kind of stillness that felt safe and sacred. It was the kind of place where people kept to their routines, where bread was baked at dawn and prayers were whispered before sleep. But behind that stillness was something else, something quieter than peace. It was avoidance. It was the kind of silence that chose not to see, even when blood seeped into the corners of its roads. The Holloway brothers were a part of this silence. Their family had farmed the land for generations, and their name carried a kind of dull respect. Nathaniel, Elias, and Abram were seen carrying grain, tending fences, smiling gently in church pews. No one wanted to believe anything darker lived behind those eyes. Yet strange things had been happening. People had vanished without a trace. A seamstress, a beggar, a blacksmith, no bodies, no screams, only absences that grew harder to ignore. And still no one asked the right questions. Some muttered that the world was changing, that sin had crept into neighboring towns and perhaps spilled into their own. But when whispers circled too close to the Holloway name, they fell away like ash in the wind. Because suspicion required action, and action required courage. And Eldam had little of either. The barn stood taller now. Its roof had been repaired with new timber, planks clean and straight against the crooked lines of the older boards. Villagers noticed the fresh wood but said nothing. They sold it themselves, after all, farmers and traders who took Holloway coin and looked away when ropes were purchased alongside nails. No one asked what the brothers were building because barns always needed fixing. Even when no livestock moved within, even when no crops were stored in its lofts, the repairs were explained away as tradition. Church elders shared meals with the Holloways, thanking their mother for her kindness, praising her sons for their hard work. They bowed their heads beside them in prayer, never wondering what those boys prayed for in silence. One elder commented once that Nathaniel's hands were unusually stained, dark at the knuckles as if something thicker than soil clung to them. The moment passed. He never asked again. Behind curtains and through fences, neighbors whispered. They whispered strange smells from the barn, of flickering light late into the night, of cries that might have been wind or might have been something else. A boy said he saw Elias carrying something wrapped in canvas, limp and heavy. His mother told him to stop lying. A farmer's dog ran into the barn one afternoon and never came out. He told himself it had run off. He told himself that even when he heard a faint whimpering from the floorboards the next evening, it wasn't that the town believed the Holloway brothers were innocent. It was that guilt required them to confront something they could not bear. To name evil meant bringing it into the daylight, and daylight was all Eldom had left. Their silence became armor. They told each other stories of bad winters and broken roads, of thieves and accidents, anything to explain the darkness gathering at the edge of their fields. Meanwhile, the Holloway barn became something more than a building. It became a shrine to unchecked evil, to what grows when fear wears the mask of normal life. With every tongue nailed, with every breath trapped in glass, with every limb bent and broken, the village lost a piece of itself, not by force, but by quiet consent. The barn groaned in the wind, and no one dared go near it. Eldom was not cursed, it was complicated. And as the rituals inside the barn deepened, the town's silence thickened like smoke, curling into every home, every heart, until no one could tell the difference between peace and rot. By the second winter after the first disappearance, the Holloway brothers had learned that pain was not only a tool, it could be a blueprint. They had moved beyond simple suffering, beyond the shock of blades or the terror of breathless panic. Those had been necessary beginnings, but now something more deliberate had taken hold in their minds. Nathaniel had started calling it the trial. Elias called it a ceremony. And Abram, who spent more and more of his hours tracing symbols into dirt and muttering to the barn's creaking beams, called it communion. Together they agreed that blood, more than breath, more than bone, was the true path. It could be drawn, counted, studied. It had temperature, speed, and rhythm. And they believed that within those rhythms truth could be found. Their victims were no longer random. They were chosen for age, for shape, for the promise of visible veins. Those who labored outdoors, whose arms were lean and sun-darkened, whose skin was too thin to hide what flowed beneath it, these were the ones taken. They were bound not by wrists or ankles anymore, but by pressure points mapped along the limbs to slow the blood without stopping it. Each was made to sit upright, held in place by slanted wooden chairs that had no legs in the back, only sharpened stakes that forced the spine straight. Nathaniel would begin the process slowly, slicing just beneath the elbow crease, watching the first stream with eyes that never blinked. Elias collected the blood in wide ceramic bowls, replacing them every few minutes, never spilling a drop. Abram, kneeling on the dirt floor, dipped thin brushes into the bowls and began to draw. The drawings were not of faces or places, they were diagrams. Endless webs of branching lines, each one representing a vein, a vessel, a junction between flow and failure. They called them maps, maps of where life slowed, where it faltered, where it cried out. The barn's walls filled with these maps, parchment pinned with rusted nails, curling at the corners as the ink dried dark red. Some had annotations, Elias's cramped writing naming pressure points or cuts that yielded more. Others had symbols Abram claimed came from the barn itself, scribbled in spirals or jagged loops that no one else could read. Each victim in their final hours became a chart, and when they finally stopped bleeding, their maps were taken down, folded in perfect squares and tucked into the narrow gaps between floorboards. The barn kept them like secrets pressed into its skin. The process could take hours, sometimes days. The goal was never to kill quickly. The goal was to witness the whole story of blood, how it moved, how it reacted to fear, how it tried to retreat. Nathaniel believed that each person's blood had its own language. Some spilled fast and angry. Others bled slowly and quietly, reluctant to leave. He kept notes on each type, measuring drops per minute, noting color, temperature, scent. When villagers went missing, he marked the day not by their name, but by the quality of their blood. He spoke of it the way a winemaker might speak of soil, but it was Abram who turned the trial into something darker. He began to speak of the barn as alive, claiming it wanted more than just blood. It wanted understanding. He said the barn was teaching them something ancient, something that had been lost and was now returning through them. He began sleeping on the barn floor, whispering to the beams, asking questions aloud and scribbling answers in the dirt. Elias humored him, but Nathaniel watched in silence, never dismissing, never laughing. He too had begun to feel the barn change. It no longer smelled only of rot and damp wood. There was something sweeter now, something sharp in the back of the throat, like copper and honey. Still the town said nothing. They blamed wolves, hunger, misfortune. The church prayed harder, but none dared step into the barn. And so the brothers continued. With every drop spilled, with every map drawn, they felt they were getting closer. To what, they could not yet name. But the trial of blood had become a doctrine, and the barn their altar. In Eldam, people stopped asking questions. In the barn, the brothers stopped needing answers. They believed they were being prepared for something greater, that every vein they mapped brought them closer to understanding what the barn wanted them to see. And as more bodies emptied, more drawings disappeared into the cracks of the floor. The barn groaned with what could only be called hunger. The harvest that year was heavier than expected. The fields bloomed gold beneath the sun, and for a time Eldam breathed easier. After years of missing people, unspoken grief, and strange sounds in the dark, the abundance of wheat felt like a blessing. Children ran between the stalks while their parents worked, chasing one another through tunnels of swaying grain, laughing as if the air had never tasted of fear. The Holloway brothers helped with the reaping. They loaded carts, tied bundles, and carried the weight of their past with the ease of routine. No one noticed the way Abram watched the children. No one thought twice when Elias offered to lead them in games near the edges of the property. And no one paid much mind when, in the final week of harvest, 3 children vanished without a sound. At first, there was confusion. The parents called their names through the fields, their voices cracking in the wind. Searchers formed, walking shoulder to shoulder, eyes scanning the tall grass and the muddy banks of nearby streams. But the wheat had already been harvested in many places, and the rest would soon follow. There was no trail, no footprints, no scraps of cloth snagged on barbed wire. After 2 days, prayers were whispered in shaking voices. After a week, those prayers turned to silence. And after a month, they were buried in memory. The town by then had learned how to forget, but the Holloway barn had not. Deep inside, beneath its dusty rafters and its blood-soaked floorboards, sat a row of sealed grain barrels, large, round, and marked with wax seals pressed by Nathaniel's hand. No one questioned why the Holloways stored grain separately from the others. No one noticed that these barrels were never opened, never touched, never moved. They were placed in a back corner, half covered with canvas as if forgotten. But they were not forgotten. They were preserved. It wasn't until early spring, when mold had crept into other stores and barrels needed opening, that a worker hired to clear old stock found one lid loose. He lifted it, expecting rot. What he found instead stopped his breath in his throat. Beneath layers of wheat, a child's hand, pale and dry, rested against the inner wall. It did not move. It was not sleeping. By the time the barrels were opened fully, horror had rooted itself into the floor. Each one held a body. 3 children, their skin preserved by the dryness of the grain, their limbs folded tightly in the fetal position. Their mouths were open, not screaming, but stuffed full of wheat, packed until their cheeks bulged and their jaws cracked. Not a single injury marked them. There was no sign of struggle, no bruise, no cut. They had been placed gently, carefully, and left to die in the very thing that should have fed them. To the brothers, it was the cruelest kind of symmetry. Nathaniel recorded the details with clinical detachment. How long it took for a sealed barrel to dehydrate a body. How the scent changed with time. How the wheat shifted around the corpse as moisture escaped. Elias noted the silence of the deaths, the lack of blood, the simplicity of the method. Abram saw something spiritual. He believed the grain was a message that life, when given too late, became poison. That food without mercy was punishment. He whispered prayers over the barrels, not for the children, but for the barn itself, which he now believed was teaching them to perfect death. When the villagers saw the bodies, they did not scream. They stared. Some covered their mouths. Others turned away. A few began to cry, but no one made a sound loud enough to name what they were witnessing. Because in the grain they saw their own failure, proof that their silence had not protected their children. It had buried them. The Holloways watched from a distance, eyes calm, hands folded. The town did not accuse them, not yet. They could not bear to connect the dots. And the barn, heavy with dust and memory, stood behind them like a monument to every truth that had been ignored. That spring the wheat did not grow as tall. The fields seemed quieter. And though no one would speak of it aloud, the smell of dried grain began to make people sick. Not because of mold, but because now they knew what else could be hidden in something meant to nourish. The barn had turned food into a grave and innocence into ritual. The barn had grown quiet in a different way now. Not the quiet of sleep or distance or dusk, but the tight, pulsing silence that lives in a room waiting for something to break. After the discovery of the children in the grain, fear spread through Eldom like smoke, thick and shapeless. People stopped looking the Holloways in the eye. Whispers turned bitter. Doors were bolted not against the cold, but against what might come in human form. Yet still no one moved against them, no one walked to the barn. It loomed at the edge of town like a scar no one would press, even as the pain beneath it deepened. Until one did. He was not a sheriff, not a priest, not a father seeking revenge, just an old carpenter named Dallum who had lived alone since his wife died years earlier. Some said grief made him fearless. Others said he was only tired of silence. One morning before the sun rose, he crossed the empty fields and stepped through the barn doors. What he found inside did not scream. It swayed. Ropes, dozens of them, hung from the rafters like drying skins. They moved gently in the stale air, though no windows were open. Each one ended in a curved iron hook, heavy and black, the kind used for meat. Some hooks were clean. Others dripped slowly into the dirt below. But what caught Dallum's breath, what froze him, were the names. Carved into the beams above each rope were initials. Some were fresh, etched with sharp lines. Others had faded into the grain. He recognized a few. Clara W. Elias had carved that one himself. M. Sirtol, the blacksmith. A.H., one of the lost children. There were more than 20. And still, more ropes waiting. Dallum ran, but not fast enough. Later, when others finally gathered the courage to follow, they found him there. Not dead, not free, but hanging. Not by the neck, by the arms. Suspended between two beams, wrists torn from the pressure, feet dragging grooves into the barn floor. His mouth was stuffed with shavings of oak, the same wood he once shaped into chairs and cradles. He was not gagged to silence him. He was gagged to remind him of what he used to build. And beneath him, scrawled in blood across the floorboards, was a sentence. He entered before it was time. This marked the beginning of what the Holloway brothers called their masterpiece. Hanging was no longer a method of killing. It was a stage. Each victim was suspended in a specific position, arms at precise angles, heads tilted as though listening. They were not allowed to die quickly. Nathaniel had built a rig that measured weight and strain, keeping bodies just low enough to draw breath but high enough that standing became impossible. Elias brought water, just enough to keep them alive. Abram whispered to them not to comfort but to instruct. He told them they were part of something greater, that their suffering was shaping the barn into what it was always meant to be. They called it the listening chamber. The brothers believed that when the hooks swayed, the barn was speaking, and when the victims moaned, it was responding. Every creak in the beams was a reply, each breathless struggle a verse in an unholy liturgy. The rafters became a choir of flesh and iron. The longer a body remained alive, the clearer the message became. Or so they claimed. Visitors never returned. Anyone who entered after that first man became part of the structure. Some were chosen, others stumbled in by mistake. One boy, no older than Abram had once been, was taken after following strange noises into the barn. He was found 3 days later, arms stretched backward and hung like clock hands. His eyes were open. He had not blinked in hours. The barn changed again. The smell of blood had grown thick, but beneath it came something else. Not rot, not death, something metallic, sweet, and old. People said the barn breathed differently now, that the ropes moved even when the wind stood still. The Holloway brothers no longer smiled in the village. They no longer pretended. They had no need. They were preparing something final. And in the center of the barn, beneath the tallest beam, an empty hook waited, its initials not yet carved, but the wood scraped and ready. By the time the constables arrived from 2 towns over, the barn had already become something else entirely. Not a crime scene, not a home. It was a structure thick with death, saturated by it in the way old wood soaks up oil, slowly, deeply until it changes color, texture, and weight. They stepped inside on a cold morning, not by force but by necessity. Rumors had reached the outside at last. Not rumors of missing people or strange boys, but of what had been seen in the rafters, hooks swinging without wind. Blood that seeped from beneath door frames, a man found with oak in his throat and initials above his head. It was no longer a question of guilt. It was a matter of how deep the horror ran. The constables entered with torches raised, but nothing prepared them. The air inside was still, yet pressed tight around the lungs. The smell was sweet and rotted, sharp as copper. Corpses hung like heavy curtains from every beam. Some fresh, some dry and curled, some long forgotten. The ropes had cut so deep that flesh had grown around them in places. Hooks clicked gently as if they breathed. Beneath the beams, ink-covered parchment clung to every wall. Vein maps, blood logs, hanging angles. Names written in delicate script beneath rows of dates. In the corner, stacked in neat piles, were glass jars labeled with breath counts. A broken altar of silence, pain, and precision. Nathaniel was found kneeling in the center, writing with a dip pen stained so black his hands looked burned. He did not run. He did not speak. He turned his head slowly, and in the dim light he smiled, not with joy, but with the calm of someone who believed he had finished something. He was arrested without resistance. One constable later reported that Nathaniel asked whether the barn would be sealed or burned, and when told neither decision had been made, he looked disappointed. Elias was caught only minutes later, halfway up the inner rafters. A noose already around his throat, he was gripping the beam and whispering something under his breath. Possibly a name, possibly a prayer, though none could hear clearly. He kicked when they pulled him down, not to escape, but because he had wanted it done. His attempt was not out of guilt. It was a ritual. It had been his plan to become part of the final chorus. He wept when they cut the rope, but Abram was gone. The youngest brother had vanished into the fields before the barn was breached. His footprints led into the wheat and then disappeared, swallowed by soil and shadow. Search parties scoured the land for days. Hounds lost his scent at the edge of a stream. Some said he drowned. Others swore they saw him years later in other villages, dressed in black, staring from a crowd before disappearing once more. But no body was ever found, no grave, no farewell. In the village there was no celebration. There were no cheers, no relief, only silence, hollow, thick, aching. Neighbors who had once shared bread and laughter with the Holloway family now avoided their own reflections. The barn was locked, then boarded, then chained, but no one touched the ropes, no one removed the bodies. Authorities argued whether it should be torn down or left as evidence, but the truth was simpler. No one had the will to enter it again. The barn remained like a mouth sealed mid-scream, filled with names no one wanted to speak aloud. Nathaniel refused to confess. He answered questions with questions, asked about the hooks, asked if they swung, asked if the others had listened long enough. Elias, broken and shivering, spoke only once. He said that the barn had asked for music and they had answered with bodies. He wept until his mouth filled with blood. The fall of the Holloways did not feel like justice. It felt like the end of a sickness too large to name. And somewhere out beyond the fields, Abram still breathed, carrying something older than guilt, something more dangerous than death. Belief. The ropes were already there. No one needed to tie new knots or raise a scaffold. The barn had made itself ready long before the town was. When the villagers voted to carry out the executions inside it, they claimed it was about justice, but everyone felt it was something else: retribution, cleansing, or maybe just the final act of a ritual they had ignored too long. Nathaniel Holloway was led to the center beam where he had once marked victims by breath and weight. Now he stood beneath the very rope he had tied, looking up at the same hook he had once sharpened. He did not speak. His eyes remained calm, as though he had finally arrived at where he belonged. The rope creaked. The crowd watched, and the barn took him without a sound. Elias followed, shaking and muttering prayers that did not match any scripture the villagers knew. His feet dragged. His body collapsed more than once. When the rope was pulled around his neck, he sobbed, not for himself, but for the ritual being ended too early. He had always wanted his suffering to mean something, and now it did. Only not in the way he imagined. Some cheered, some wept. One woman whispered that it didn't feel like justice. It felt like repetition. Like the town had become the barn's final accomplice. And maybe it had, because by using the same ropes, the same beams, the same silence, they hadn't erased what the Holloways had built. They had sealed it, completed it. Nathaniel's hook stopped swinging by dusk, Elias's by nightfall. But the barn itself felt unchanged. It groaned once in the dark, long and low as if pleased. And still Abram's rope waited. The barn didn't fall in a storm. It didn't burn or shatter or collapse with drama. It sank slowly, board by board, until one morning it was simply gone, flattened into its own rot, like a secret too heavy to keep standing. By then, most of the town had grown used to pretending it wasn't there. Children were told not to go near it. Adults crossed the road to avoid its shadow. But when it finally gave out, when the roof caved and the beams buckled, something deeper seemed to break with it. What remained wasn't just timber. It was evidence. Under the floorboards, they found papers sealed in wax, hidden notes, vein maps, a ledger cataloging each victim by breath, by blood volume, by hours survived. There were drawings so detailed they looked more like obsession than memory. Each fold of skin, each limb bent into angles that matched no natural posture. And there were confessions. Pages of Elias's handwriting, steady and clean, documenting how they refined cruelty until it became structured. How silence was not just a side effect, but the goal. How the town, by looking away, had become part of the ritual. The documents were not released. Officials said they were too disturbing, that they would protect the public by keeping them sealed. But those who had seen them even for a moment never forgot the diagrams. They said the worst part wasn't the violence, it was the care, the ritual precision. The way each death had been shaped to mean something. A memorial was built, stone clean with no names, just the phrase for the voices taken. People left flowers. School children came in silence. But the barn's memory didn't live in stone. It lived in the questions people stopped asking, in the records that vanished, in the final rope that had never held Abram's weight. Because evil, when it grows close to home, does not declare itself. It doesn't arrive with fire or threat. It blends in. It listens. I study. It waits to be ignored. The Holloways didn't hide their faces. They simply wore the ones the town needed to see. And so the barn stands no longer. But its silence lingers,